Neighbor Karen won't stop stealing my electricity to charge her car. I live in a quaint, middle-class suburban neighborhood, nestled on a quiet street where the houses are modest yet well-kept. My home is a small single-family residence, a charming mid-century modern design with clean lines and large windows that let in the morning sun. The front yard is a patch of green, meticulously maintained, with a few flower beds adding a splash of color. The driveway, narrow yet functional, is shared with the neighboring property, a rental house that has seen its fair share of tenants over the years. The shared driveway has always been a point of harmony between my neighbor and me. The previous tenants were considerate, always consulting me before using any shared resources. We communicated well, cooperating on maintenance tasks and ensuring the driveway was clear for both our vehicles. There were no issues with parking or the use of shared spaces. It was a seamless arrangement that made living here comfortable. Then came Jill and her boyfriend, Stephen. They moved into the neighboring rental property, and from the start, Jill's demeanor was strikingly different. She exuded an air of entitlement, often dismissing my presence with a curt nod or a brief, uninterested glance. Stephen, on the other hand, seemed less engaged, more passive, and rarely involved in the dynamics between us. Their first interactions with me were cordial, but it didn't take long for signs of inconsideration to surface. Jill drove a flashy, brand-new sports car that took up a significant portion of the shared driveway. The sleek vehicle, with its polished exterior and roaring engine, was a stark contrast to my modest sedan. It often sat there, occupying space that was meant for both our vehicles, leaving me to maneuver around it awkwardly. I tried to brush it off at first, thinking it was just a temporary inconvenience, but it became a recurring issue. The real problems began when Jill started hosting loud parties late into the night. The music blared, guests came and went at all hours, and the noise disrupted the peace of our once quiet neighborhood. Trash, beer cans, wrappers, and party-related debris was regularly left in the shared areas, making the driveway and front yard look like a dumping ground. I found myself picking up after her guests, a task that felt increasingly unfair. On several occasions, Jill and Stephen blocked my vehicle, causing me to be late. Each time, I felt a surge of frustration, but I tried to approach the situation calmly, hoping that a direct conversation would resolve the issues. I knocked on their door, explained my concerns, and asked them to be more considerate. Jill's response was dismissive, brushing off my concerns as trivial. Stephen remained silent, offering no support or acknowledgement. As the weeks went by, the situation deteriorated. Jill's parties became more frequent and louder, the trash more abundant, and the parking issues more blatant. I felt like I was living in someone else's world, where my comfort and peace were secondary to their whims. The shared driveway, once a symbol of neighborly cooperation, had become a source of constant tension and frustration. I couldn't continue to let Jill and Stephen trample over my rights and peace of mind. But I also knew that confronting them directly hadn't yielded any results. I needed a plan, a way to assert my rights without escalating the conflict further. The thought of involving authorities crossed my mind, but I hesitated, unsure of the repercussions. I decided to start by documenting everything, the dates, times, and nature of each incident. I hoped that having a record would help me make a stronger case if things escalated. In the meantime, I continued to deal with the daily inconveniences. I parked my car in the street, hoping it wouldn't be blocked in. I picked up the trash left behind, even though it wasn't my responsibility. I tried to maintain a cordial relationship with Jill and Stephen, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. The strain was evident, and I could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me. One evening, after another loud party, I stood in my front yard, staring at the mess left behind. The driveway was littered with empty bottles and wrappers, and the noise from the party still echoed in the air. I felt a surge of anger and helplessness. This wasn't the peaceful neighborhood I had moved into. This wasn't the community I had hoped to be a part of. I knew something had to change, but I wasn't sure what steps to take next. As I stood there, contemplating my next move, I noticed Jill and Stephen leaving their house, laughing and chatting as they got into their car. They didn't even glance in my direction. It was as if they were oblivious to the chaos they had caused. I felt a pang of resentment. How could they be so indifferent? How could they not see the impact of their actions on those around them? In the midst of dealing with the ongoing issues in the shared driveway, I faced another problem. I had recently bought an electric vehicle, and with that came the need for a dedicated charger. While the neighborly conflicts were still unresolved, this was something I could control. I had been researching it for months, knowing I would need a level 2 charger to make the most of my new car's range and charging speed. I carefully considered where to install it, and after a bit of thought, I decided that the best place was in my side of the shared driveway. It was tucked to the right of my driveway, just far enough from the shared border to ensure that it wouldn't cause any further disputes. The driveway was already narrow, but I figured this would be the most practical solution. The installation wasn't cheap. I hired a certified electrician to handle the wiring and make sure everything was up to code. This involved checking my electrical panel's capacity to handle the load and installing a dedicated 240-volt circuit, which was essential for the charger to work properly. I had to get the necessary permits, and the whole process took several weeks. The cost of the charger itself, along with installation fees and permits, ranged from $1,200 to $2,100. The price varied depending on the complexity of the installation, such as whether my electrical system required upgrades. It was a significant investment, but one I had to make to ensure I could charge my new car efficiently. The electrician did a great job, and soon the charger was installed and ready to use. I made sure it was clearly marked as my personal charger, installed on my side of the driveway, and plugged into my own electricity bill. I thought this would be the end of it. The last thing I needed was another hassle in my already stressful life. However, it wasn't long before Jill and Steven's disregard for boundaries extended to this new addition. A few weeks after I installed the charger, Jill bought a new Tesla Model 3. However, she didn't bother installing her own charger. At first, I was a little confused, but I didn't think much of it and let it slide. Then, one evening, I parked my car and plugged it into the charger, expecting to wake up to a fully charged battery. After some time, I went outside to check on it and was immediately taken aback. My car had been unplugged, and Jill's Tesla was plugged into the charger instead. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing, before my frustration set in. My charger, something I had paid for and installed, was being used without permission, and to make matters worse, it was taking up all the electricity, leaving my car with no charge. I walked over to their door, knocking with a mix of frustration and disbelief. Jill answered with a pleasant, if not slightly patronizing, smile. Hey Jill, I noticed my car is unplugged, and your car is using my charger. I just want to make sure we're clear, this charger is for my personal use. It's not for anyone else to use without asking. Jill raised an eyebrow and shrugged casually. Oh, it comes with the house, right? The landlord said it's part of the property. It's not a big deal. I could feel my patience thinning. No, it doesn't. I paid for it, and it's hooked up to my electricity bill. I don't mind sharing, but I need to be asked first, and it can't be used whenever you feel like it. It's my property. She smirked, acting as if I was overreacting. Well, it's in the driveway we share, so I thought it was a communal thing. Plus, it's not like I'm keeping your car from charging. I'll be done in an hour or so. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or scream. I tried to stay calm. I don't care how long it takes. You can't just plug your car in whenever you want. It's not yours. I turned to leave, hoping that would be the end of it. But of course, it wasn't. Over the next few weeks, Jill and Steven repeatedly used the charger without asking. Each time I found my car unplugged and theirs hooked up to my charger, I felt more and more irritated. It wasn't just about the inconvenience, it was the principle of the thing. I'd paid for the charger, and it wasn't some shared resource for the neighborhood to use at their convenience. I tried speaking with Jill again. Hey, I noticed you've been using the charger again. I'm asking nicely that you stop. But if this continues, I'll have to take other steps. Jill waved me off with a dismissive hand. Relax. It's just a little electricity. You don't even need it all the time. We're neighbors. It's no big deal. I wasn't sure whether she truly didn't understand, or if she just didn't care. Either way, this wasn't going to be something I could let slide. A few days later, I found Steven unplugging my car and plugging in his own vehicle. I snapped. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I demanded. He looked up from his car with an exaggerated shrug. "Relax, dude. It's just a little power. What's the big deal?" A little power could add up to a hefty electricity bill. Not to mention the inconvenience of not having my car charged when I needed it. "It's not just a little power, it's theft," I said. "This is my property, and I've asked you not to use it." Steven chuckled dismissively. "Chill out. It's not like I'm stealing your car." I stood there, seething. I wasn't going to get through to him. I had already tried to handle this calmly, but clearly, that approach wasn't working. I knew something had to change, but I wasn't sure how far I was willing to go to make sure they respected my property. I started making a mental note of each time they used the charger without asking. I began to realize how much it was affecting my day-to-day life. My ability to charge my car for work, the increasing cost of my electricity bill, and the growing sense that Jill and Steven felt entitled to things that weren't theirs. The line had been crossed, and now it was time to figure out how to handle it once and for all. After weeks of frustration, I finally reached a breaking point. I could no longer tolerate the repeated invasions of my property. My patience had worn thin, and I knew I needed to take action. I decided to call the police to formally report the theft of electricity and property. Jill's blatant disregard for my rights had gone far enough. I dialed the non-emergency police line and explained the situation. I was calm but firm, detailing how Jill and Steven had repeatedly used my charger without permission, and how they had unplugged my car to charge theirs. The officer on the other end of the line assured me that they would send officers to resolve the issue. When the police arrived, Jill was furious. She immediately accused me of being unreasonable. Her voice was sharp, and she insisted that I had no right to control the charger since it was located in the shared driveway. I tried to remain composed as I explained to the officers that the charger was my personal property, something I had paid for and had installed at my own expense. The officers listened attentively as I provided receipts for the charger and installation, showing them that I was the rightful owner. I also showed them my electricity bills, clearly demonstrating that the charger was hooked up to my account. The officers looked over the documents and then turned to Jill, who was still arguing. After a brief exchange, the officers quickly realized Jill's claim was baseless. One of the officers explained to her that the charger was not part of her rental agreement and that it belonged to me. Jill's face reddened with embarrassment as the officer pointed out that using my charger without permission was both inconsiderate and wrong. To my surprise, Jill became defensive, accusing the officers of siding with me. The officer calmly explained that her behavior could be considered false reporting and that she could face legal consequences if she continued with these baseless claims. The officers made it clear to Jill that she had no right to use the charger. "You need to leave it alone," the officer told her firmly. "This is the property of your neighbor. If you continue to interfere with it, there will be legal consequences." Jill stood there, seething, before turning on her heel and storming back to her house. She shot me one last glare before disappearing inside. The officers turned to me, giving me a reassuring nod. I felt a sense of victory. Finally, someone had taken my concerns seriously, and Jill's ridiculous claims had been debunked. The police had backed me up, and I knew now that my rights had been clearly established. As much as I wanted to believe things would finally settle down, I knew Jill's behavior wouldn't change. She had already shown how far she would go to ignore my boundaries, and I couldn't risk further conflict. To protect my property and avoid future problems, I decided to move the charger into my garage, where Jill and Steven would no longer be able to access it. The process of moving the charger was not simple. I had to hire professionals to relocate it inside my garage, and I needed to ensure everything was up to code. The cost of the relocation was substantial, but I felt it was necessary. I didn't want to risk having my property used without permission again, and the thought of more confrontation was too much to bear. Though the move was costly, I considered it a small price to pay for peace of mind. As the professionals finished the relocation, I knew that the charger would finally be safe from Jill and Steven's interference. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but wonder how much longer I would have to keep dealing with their entitlement and disregard for the boundaries I had set. The morning after the charger was moved into my garage, I woke up to the sound of loud knocking on my front door. I was barely out of bed when I heard Jill's voice on the other side, sharp and demanding. I opened the door, already knowing what this was about. "Where's my charger?" She practically spat, her face twisted with anger. She stood there, her hands on her hips, looking more annoyed than concerned. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my calm. "It's not your charger, Jill. I moved it into my garage. It's my property, and I have every right to do so." She didn't even try to hide her fury. "You can't just take it. I need it for my car." "This is outrageous," she exclaimed. Her voice was rising with each word, and I could see the wheels turning in her head as she prepared her next argument. "You can't take it without my permission," she added, her tone accusatory. "You're stealing from me. I'll have you arrested for theft." I stared at her, feeling a surge of disbelief. This was the same person the police had already told to stop using my charger, and now she was accusing me of theft? My patience was wearing thin, but I kept my voice steady. "No, Jill, I'm not stealing anything. I paid for that charger, and I've been clear with you about my boundaries. You had no right to use it, and I've had enough. I'm not going to let this continue." Her eyes flared with anger, and for a moment, I thought she might say something worse. But instead, she turned and stormed off, muttering under her breath about how she would take legal action. I closed the door and stood there for a few moments, feeling a mix of frustration and relief. The confrontation had been exhausting, but I knew I had done the right thing by moving the charger. As expected, it wasn't long before Jill escalated things. A few hours later, I heard another knock on my door. This time, it was the police. 2 officers stood on my porch, looking a little puzzled as they introduced themselves. "We received a call about a missing charger," one of the officers said. "Jill is claiming it was stolen from her." I tried to keep my expression neutral as I invited them inside. "I'm happy to explain the situation," I said, motioning toward the living room. "It's actually my charger, and I had it moved into my garage. Jill has no right to use it, and I've asked her repeatedly not to." I could see the officers exchanging glances as I showed them the receipts for the charger and installation. I also gave them copies of my electricity bills, proving that the charger was hooked up to my account. As I spoke, I could sense the officers' skepticism growing, but they were professional enough not to voice their doubts immediately. Jill, of course, had followed the officers, standing outside the door with her arms crossed. The officers stepped outside, and the conversation grew heated. I couldn't hear all of it, but I could see Jill gesturing wildly, her words more and more exaggerated. After several minutes, one of the officers came back inside and told me that Jill's claim was completely unfounded. "We've explained to her that the charger was never hers," the officer said. "She's been informed that you have every right to move it, and she needs to stop making these false claims." Jill's face turned pale, and I could see the anger simmering beneath her skin. The officers warned her that if she continued with her harassment or false reporting, she could face legal consequences. "This is a civil matter," the officer told her firmly. "You need to leave your neighbor alone, or we'll have no choice but to take further steps." Jill stood there, her face twisted with resentment. But she didn't say anything more. The officers, satisfied that the situation had been resolved, turned and left. I felt a sense of finality wash over me as I closed the door behind them. The police had sided with me, and Jill's false accusations had been put to rest. Though the police had intervened, I knew that Jill's resentment wouldn't just disappear. Over the following weeks, whenever we crossed paths in the neighborhood, I could feel her eyes on me, sharp, cold, and full of disdain. There was no more casual acknowledgement, no polite nods when we passed each other. Instead, she would glare at me as if I were the villain in some twisted drama. I wasn't interested in further conflict, but I was also determined to not let her entitlement get to me. I had done what I could to protect my property, and I wasn't going to let her disrupt my life any more than she already had. I continued with my routine: work, errands, quiet evenings at home, But I remained vigilant, knowing that Jill's resentment could turn into something more. To safeguard my home and prevent any further interference, I installed security cameras. I figured it was a wise move, not just for the charger but for overall peace of mind. The cameras would monitor my property, ensuring that if Jill or Steven decided to make any further moves against me, I would have a record of their actions. I wasn't willing to let them push me around anymore. The cameras also gave me a sense of control. I had always felt helpless, caught in the middle of their disregard for my boundaries. But now I felt empowered. I had taken steps to protect my property, and I had stood my ground. I realized that, in a way, this whole experience had taught me valuable lessons about conflict resolution and protecting my rights. I didn't want to get involved in petty arguments or escalate things unnecessarily, but I also wouldn't let anyone walk all over me. Looking back on the whole ordeal, I couldn't help but reflect on the broader lessons I had learned. Living next to entitled neighbors who think they can use other people's property without permission is challenging, to say the least. It takes patience, but it also requires a firm resolve to stand up for what's right. The key is to not let your frustration cloud your judgment, but also to not be afraid to take the necessary steps to protect your rights. I also realized that sometimes people like Jill and Steven don't understand boundaries because they've never had to respect anyone else's. They assume that because they live close to someone, they have some sort of claim over that person's property. The challenge is in teaching them that just because they can take something doesn't mean they should.